Young Turks, everybody. Ben Mankiewicz here, joining us now from Washington, D.C., I presume. Karl Frisch from Media Matters. The website is MediaMatters.org. You know, it's one of the best websites out there because essentially Bill O'Reilly refers to you guys as fascists. So I don't know you get better advertising than that. Anyway, what Media Matters does, for those who don't know, and I know anybody who watches this show probably does know, is they fact check and they call the right, the Hannitys, the Limbaughs, the Becks, and many others on all the outrageous things that they say. And what's significant about that, and what we have to remember, is that for 20 years and actively for 10, nobody called them on anything. And they played an enormous role in framing the debate in this country. They still, on the right, play an enormous role in framing the debate. But Media Matters, part of the pushback, a big part of it. Karl, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
It didn't before. You know, the irony here is, and the fact is, Ted Kennedy is a public figure and a politician, and I'm not really outraged or offended by anything anyone says about him, because I think that's a waste of time, and I guarantee you it didn't bother Ted Kennedy what people said about him. So I don't think we should be.
His own colleagues used to go home and raise money off of his name, and then return home, and they'd work on legislation together.
Right. So there is a ridiculous. Exactly. That's exactly right. And so if Ted Kennedy has his way, and then you'd raise some money, and then you'd go back home and be like, all right, Ted.
Hey, Ted, can I have your vote on this bill?
Right. We need to get stuff done. Ted, I need to talk to you. So, I mean, that's how it works. So, but Republicans are feigning outrage at Democrats for exploiting Ted Kennedy's name in trying to sort of work for health care reform. Is that Is that what's happening?
To say it mildly, I didn't know there were so many pots and kettles in the Republican in the conservative movement. They've been storming Camelot since Wednesday morning. And
what are some of the most egregious examples here? I talked about Mike Huckabee earlier in the show, but there are obviously others.
Yeah, well, you've got Rush Limbaugh saying that, see, I told you, they're going to name it the Ted Kennedy Memorial Health Care Bill. Of course, he said that right after Kennedy was announced that he had cancer.
Yeah, didn't Rush Limbaugh brag about correctly predicting Kennedy's death?
Basically, yes. He took it a lot further. He said, he's surprised that the Constitution is still intact after, he said 52 years of Kennedy in the Senate. It was, not 52 years.
Right.
And worse. And then you've got...
well, I tell you what, before you get off of Limbaugh, let's hear from Rush Limbaugh. We have one of these clips of Limbaugh talking about Kennedy, where Limbaugh breaks down really what Ted Kennedy did in the Senate. Rush Limbaugh manages to sum it up in a sentence. Let's hear number 4 here, JR. Here is Rush Limbaugh discussing Ted Kennedy.
And I'm wondering about Senator Kennedy's will. Is Senator Kennedy a man of the people? Senator Kennedy, who is beloved for one reason, folks. He used the government to take money from people at work to give it to people that don't work. And that was his chit. That got him out of any serious judgment on any bad behavior in his personal life. It works for all liberals. It is their redemption. All you do is make a big play. You use government to take money away from people who work and have earned it, give it to people that don't, and you are compassionate, you are caring, and you are virtuous. And then you can go into La Brasserie in Washington with your buddy Chris Dodd and start having waitress sandwiches.
All right, a couple of things there. First of all, the waitress sandwich sounds awesome.
I think it comes on rye.
So go with your buddy Chris Dodd to La Brasserie in Washington and have waitress sandwiches. So I didn't realize...
Rush likes his waitress sandwich with a creamy mayonnaise concocted with a little bit of oxy.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. All right, so I didn't realize that you could sort of break Ted Kennedy down that simply. Is he takes money from people who work, gives money to people who don't work.
Right.
So what else has been happening? So
well, you have that. I think we when they weren't busy just outright assaulting Kennedy's legacy, a lot of media conservatives like Fox News' Laura Ingraham were basically saying that Democrats were going to use this to stifle debate and push health care through, and they were saying that they were going to use the death card because now Republican talking points have come down to death and the word that follows.
Right. It's interesting because I made this point in the last segment, and I'm curious whether you think this has any validity, Karl. And we're talking to Karl Frisch from Media Matters for America, the website, a really fantastic website where all this information is, MediaMatters.org. Let's suppose that, tragic as it would have been, that Martin Luther King were assassinated not in April of 1968, but in 1964, before the passage of the Civil Rights Act.
Exactly.
These guys are arguing, Laura Ingraham and Mike Huckabee, who said today that, who suggested again that it's wrong for Democrats to sort of invoke Kennedy's name and exploit his death to help drum up support for the cause that Kennedy considered most dear to his entire public life. So let's suggest that Martin Luther King were killed in 1964 before the passage of the Civil Rights Act. Are these guys suggesting that it would have been wrong for people to say, hey, we should pass this in Martin Luther King's name? I mean, putting it to me in those terms reminds you of what a ridiculous argument this is.
Well, it also points out how hypocritical they are.
Yeah.
I mean, how often, for how long, have we had to hear about win one for the Gipper?
Yeah, right, of course. Yeah.
So it's just ridiculous. They probably would have called it death rights.
Yeah.
Back then. But, and the converse is just how much they've been using Ted Kennedy to go after health care, to attack health care.
Right.
What do you mean? They say stuff like, if Ted Kennedy were still here, we'd be able to reach compromise and get this thing done. Really? People like John McCain said that. People like Orrin Hatch.
This is interesting, Karl, because I thought that I was impressed by that line from McCain. That came Sunday. That was before Ted Kennedy died. And I thought, oh, wow, that's because it was incredibly complimentary about what he can do, what he can offer. You think that there was a degree of I don't know, exploitation or manipulation in that?
Well, let's think of it this way. They sat in the committee that Ted Kennedy had chaired, and the Kennedy health care bill passed that committee without a single Republican vote. So, I think it's a bit disingenuous to say that had Ted Kennedy been there, they'd have something. And it hasn't just been those two senators. It's now a staple Republican talking point. You'll see it from every pundit that's on cable tonight and that was on cable last night. The fact of the matter is, when you hear stuff from Republicans in the Gang of Six and other Republicans where there is no budging, they don't just not want the public option. They don't want something like a public option that kicks in if things get even worse. They don't want a co-op. They don't want health care reform, period. And so this is what we're going to continue to hear. And, Joan Walsh from Salon.com pointed out that, there's absolutely no evidence that supports that point of view. I think it was Ezra Klein from the Washington Post that pointed out that they already had an opportunity to work with Ted Kennedy, and the bill was reported out of committee, and it was a progressive one at that.
Right. Yeah. Well, those are totally valid points. You mentioned the use of the word death and then another word. That's the Republican game plan.
The death card.
Right now.
There is a new one. It's called Death Puppies, and they are seeing eye dogs used by Obama's Gestapo to kill the blind in a cost-saving effort to reduce the cost of the Americans with Disabilities Act.
It's a good point, because it also, by the way, and nobody's even pointed this out about the death puppies, but I saw this when I read it, that will also save money on food for those dogs.
This is exactly true.
Right. I'm wondering whether another talking point is emerging. Again, getting back to what Mike Huckabee said Thursday on his radio show, the Huckabee Report. He says that he suggested on his radio show that under President Obama's health care plan, Kennedy would have been told to, quote, go home to take pain pills and die.
That's a pretty tame way of saying it compared to how some people put it.
Yeah, I agree. But he said, when Senator Kennedy was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer at 77, did he give up on life and go home to take pain pills and die? Of course he didn't. But that already struck me, since he said it twice, that is another suggestion that, death panels, we've moved on to death panels, but they're like, okay, we're not going to have death panels, but essentially, if you have a serious illness and you're old, because it's all about scaring old people,
right.
Is that you have a serious illness and you're old, that your doctor will tell you to take 3 Nuprin and go die.
Yeah, right. Because that's how it's always done, really.
That's how it's done, and who wouldn't put that in a health care bill?
Right. I mean, I think it's probably spelled out specifically like that. I haven't read the legislation though, so over on Lou Dobbs' radio show, Tom Marr, who was guest hosting for Dobbs, basically said the same thing, saying that under a public option, a bureaucrat would have told Kennedy, "You're 77, brain tumor, bye-bye."
Yeah, right. I read that from Tom Marr, and that sounds like that's again what they're suggesting. And do we know where they're getting that, or is that again just a creation that they know?
It's a creation. I mean, let's be honest. When Medicare Part D was passed by the Senate with 42 Republican votes, it included some coverage of end-of-life counseling. And, we've seen this with the death panel BS. We've seen this with the death book BS, which apparently gives severe paper cuts to veterans who use it, thus causing their painful bleeding out death over the course of 40 years. I'm still not quite sure on what they meant by death book. But ultimately, what these end-of-life counseling sessions are designed for, really, by the way, these things already happen. It's a question of whether or not insurance is going to have to cover it. They're designed so that parents don't have to put their children in the awful situation of deciding what happens at the end of life for their parents. And in the case of this death book, quote unquote, the first option listed was to use all life-sustaining measures possible. So I don't know how that actually kills somebody.
Yeah. Now, but isn't the problem is that it's not enough to simply suggest that when Tom Marr says no 70, there'll be a bureaucrat saying, "Hey, you're 77, you have brain tumor, so long," and that when Mike Huckabee says, take 2 Advil, go home and die, that's it. Here's some pain pills, go home and die. That all the Republicans want out of this at all is is to plant a seed. They know
Right.
that that's not right. It doesn't make any difference.
They don't care, of course.
Nobody's going to, they want us to waste our time, which essentially we have to do now, to disprove it. And because then all they want to do is people who don't pay enough attention to say, I don't know, man, I hear there's going to be a death panel, or they might not cover if you get really sick and you're older, they just may tell you to take pain pills. I don't know. So, you know what? I'm a little scared. Let's just do nothing.
No, that's exactly what they want. And it couldn't be more disingenuous because I do feel that for the most part they know that this stuff isn't in there. Maybe Sarah Palin and Michelle Bachmann don't know, but I think for the most part these politicians are a bit more savvy than that. Their goal is to slow this thing down to a snail's pace and kill it. I think it's the responsibility of people that care about issues like health care reform, or any issue for that matter. We always say, whatever the most important issue is to you, make sure the media is your next most important issue, because how they talk about that issue will define what happens with that issue.
And do you see any, I realize that the job you guys have is to find out what Rush Limbaugh and Bill O'Reilly and their
Well, we're also
say, but
looking
do you see an effective pushback?
The death panel thing specifically, and we spend a chunk of time looking at the right-wing media, but we're monitoring the mainstream media as well to make sure that conservative misinformation doesn't get in there. The traditional media has fact-checked the death panel thing more than 40 times. So hopefully, for the people that can be convinced when presented with proper evidence that the death panel thing does not exist, they're getting that message. There is a crop of people that will never be convinced.
Sure, of course.
Those are the people that at the end of the Bush administration, the 26% that still thought he did a fine job.
Right, you're right. You're never going to get them on this in any way, shape, or form.
Right. They're more concerned about walking off the edge of the planet.
That's a fair concern.
It is.
That would be horrible.
Being flat and everything.
But what worries me, and again, this is not, and I'm glad you pointed out the degree to which you guys fact check the mainstream media, because of course what the right wing media wants is for their doubts to bleed into the mainstream media, and then the seed is planted, and so obviously you guys got to check that. But of course, what this still creates is a scenario where they drive the debate, and the healthcare debate becomes a debate not about whether we have a right to coverage, whether that is an inalienable right, whether we are discriminating against people who don't have health care. It becomes a debate about whether there are death panels.
Right.
And
one thing that we talked about at Media Matters was it was not just enough to for the mainstream press to fact-check this claim. Not only did they have to say that it was false, but they should also point out what the status quo currently is, because there is a form of death panel that already exists, and it's called a person's health insurance provider.
Right.
Every day, health insurance companies are deciding what, when your doctor suggests treatment or asks for treatment, whether or not you're going to get that treatment. And people die as a result of insurance companies saying no, or deciding to do some oppo research on a patient to make sure that, to see if they've ever possibly lied in their applications or in their paperwork to find a pre-existing condition to terminate coverage. This happens every day, and it happens because they're looking out for their bottom line to make some money. That should also be part of the conversation. In order to have a conversation about what the government plans on doing, it's an essential part of the conversation to talk about what's currently the system.
Well, Karl Frisch from MediaMatters.org, I couldn't agree with you more. My fear still, it's not a fear. It's
I share the fear.
Is that, again, we're still end up having the conversations that they want us to have. Thank God you guys are doing what you're doing, and that the Young Turks is here, but again, it is a conversation largely, continuously dictated by guys like Rush Limbaugh.
If only we had the cojones to do the conversation the same way towards them.
Right, but God forbid, we wouldn't want to insult
We wouldn't want to be mean.
Wouldn't want to be mean. Can't be mean. All right, Karl Frisch, MediaMatters.org. Karl, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Jake.